Question?
What happens if there's an appeal of the recount results filed in circuit court after the recount is complete, and that circuit court decision is not made by the December 13th deadline?
It's a good question. I'll let Mr. Haas go first, and then I'll give you my thoughts.
I think from the perspective of the Elections Commission, our job is to make sure that the recount gets completed and completed by December 13th. If there's any court action after that, then it's really going to be in the hands of the court and the parties. The Elections Commission would be represented by the Department of Justice, but there isn't, I don't believe, any clear answer as far as how that interacts with the federal deadlines. As some of you may recall, in the 2000 Bush v. Gore decision, the U.S. Supreme Court made its decision on that 35th day, and that's what prevented that federal deadline from coming into play.
This is, as the chair and as a member of the Democratic Party on the commission, we cut the timeline down as tight as we could to get the recount completed within the safe harbor provisions. I fully expect, given the history of how elections are conducted in Wisconsin and their accuracy and my trust in my citizens who are counting these votes, that the outcome is not going to be different. I certainly assume that the margin won't, it may be not 22,177, but I don't doubt that the president-elect is going to win that vote. I think that should be sufficient for any decision in Congress as to how those electoral votes should be cast. We can't stop, this issue of final determination. It would be, we really thought, or I personally really thought that to try to count it tighter would be a much, much, much bigger problem than having it done in such a way. The other thing is, it's the 35 days, but there's also, isn't there an additional 6 days built in?
December 19th is the meeting of the presidential.
Right, so, that still would allow, I mean, it's tight, but then it would be a judicial determination. But we did everything we could.
And this is certainly not Bush v. Gore. I mean, the likelihood of a court appeal of this recount decision is certainly a lot different than the context in that case.
Michael or Mark, can you, in simple terms, break down what it is exactly you're asking people to do, the clerks to do here? Is it, and I don't want to oversimplify it, simply taking the ballot and putting it back in the machine to see if you got the same number?
That's for Mike.
In the end, it's a matter of looking at the ballot and the tabulators agreeing on either a hand count. In a hand count, the tabulators agreeing what the vote is, or examining the ballot and putting it back into the voting equipment. But before that happens, there's a series of steps that they have to take to reconcile other election materials, to look at the poll list, reconcile poll lists, look at absentee ballot materials. So the actual working with the ballots is not the end of the story. There's a lot of other technical steps, procedural steps that they need to take to ensure that the number of voters that are marked on the poll list as voting matches the number of ballots that are being counted, a number of checks like that.
Where in the state, what counties specifically are you hearing that are going to have the most difficult time getting this done by December 12th now?
Well, many of the county clerks were not around when we sent the two emails, and so we haven't really had a chance to hear much feedback from them except for the clerks that immediately responded to our request for estimates. So in general, I think we would expect the most populous counties. They have the most ballots to count, the most voters obviously. They need to recruit the most number of bodies to be available. And we can give you an example of the recount in the 32nd Senate District. There's 4 counties involved. La Crosse is the most populous county. They estimated that they will finish counting their ballots in 5 to 6 days. they will now have to have a second recount to process those ballots again and count the presidential election. In theory, it shouldn't take any longer than it did for the Senate district recount, although you may have more observers and more objections to deal with. But other smaller counties, Crawford and Monroe counties, told us they expected more like 2 to 3 to 4 days. So many, as I said, many of our counties we expect to be finished in a week or a little over a week. But if you talk about Dane County, Milwaukee County, Greene County, Waukesha County, some of our more populous counties, it is going to be a challenge.
The people who have requested this recount have expressed concern about the possibility that machines were hacked. Have you seen anything to justify that concern?
No.
Jill Stein actually said on Friday on CNN, she had questions about certain voting machines in certain counties in Wisconsin. She didn't say specifically. Do you know what she's talking about? She said, quote, some of the voting machines in use in Wisconsin, for example, have actually been prohibited in the state of California because they've basically been proven to be wide open tampering, she said on CNN.
No, we're not aware of what equipment she might be referring to as far as equipment that has been prohibited from use in California. The process in Wisconsin is that the equipment is tested at the federal level and certified at the federal level for technical standards, how the equipment works, security standards. Then if a manufacturer wants to sell equipment to municipal clerks in Wisconsin, our agency tests the equipment again to make sure it complies with our statutes and how votes are tabulated. And then it is approved by the commission or by the Government Accountability Board previously. And then before each election, the voting equipment needs to be tested by the municipal clerk within 10 days of the election. That's a public test. Anybody is welcome to come and see that the ballots that are run through the equipment are being tabulated correctly. Then the equipment is secured, the programming is secured until election day. Election inspectors at the beginning of the day need to go through a protocol to make sure that the software is showing 0 votes at the beginning of the day. They need to make sure it's secured throughout the day. So we've said many times that there are a number of reasons why we are skeptical of any claims that voting equipment is either not working correctly or being tampered with in the state of Wisconsin. Among those reasons are it is not connected to the internet. We have a number of different systems in place in the state. We have a very decentralized system, and an individual would need to have unfettered physical access to voting equipment and to be able to enter the locked cabinet where the software, the memory device is located. And to do that once and be detected is hard to believe it could happen. To do that throughout the state with a variety of different equipment it seems very unlikely.
So just elaborate on that a little bit, Mike. I think there's been an assumption that someone through the internet or through some other electronic connection could access voting machines and reprogram or repurpose them. But again, we have about 1,800 municipalities in the state, correct? Are you saying that over a significant number of those municipalities, people would have to physically access the voting machines and reprogram them?
Right, because if it's not connected to the internet, in theory, you cannot tamper with it over the internet. I'll let Ross chime in if he has anything else to add.
I really don't. I mean, it's as simple as in order to access the equipment, you would actually have to get your hands on it. And our security protocols ensure that at the municipal level that all that equipment is under lock and key with authorization limited to only personnel within that office. And there's processes where tamper evidence seals are put on the equipment immediately after the public test. That's verified before the polls open, and again after the polls close. And in Wisconsin, for any of the touchscreen voting systems that are used, state law requires that we have what's called the voter verified paper audit trail, and that's the official ballot, and that's what will be used for the recount throughout the state.
And we might as well, I guess, address the claim or the theories that equipment has programming in it that is automatically triggered on election day. Again, the people who program the equipment are either the county clerks or the equipment vendors who are authorized to program the equipment. So you need to believe that those individuals are either intentionally or unintentionally installing some malware that is going to be triggered on election day and not be detected through any other process. that we've described.
Just to elaborate on that one last thing, in many cases, these machines are quite old, correct? I mean, which is another issue entirely, but, I mean, in certain cases, the vendor would have sold it to us many years ago, right?
Correct, yes.
Many of these systems were required as part of the 2002 Help America Vote Act. And so in many of the rural locations, these touchscreen systems were purchased to provide accessibility to individuals with disabilities. And these are jurisdictions that have historically always hand counted paper ballots, and many of these same locations, even though they now have touchscreen voting systems, will still have had voters vote using paper ballots. And so when the recount will tabulate both ballots that were counted by hand and then also ballots that were tabulated by the electronic voting equipment.
So someone would have to tamper with each machine. There would be no way to access multiple voting machines to tamper or alter the vote count.
None that we are aware of.
Let me just say this on this issue. I think we're going to look back when this recount is completed and find that the system worked well, and I don't expect that the outcome will be qualitatively different than the recount at the Supreme Court, where we had a minimal amount of votes done. That will tell us what the staff is telling the commission, is that it is a decentralized and relatively safe system, and was confirmed before with, there were meetings with Homeland Security prior to that there hadn't been any attacks on Wisconsin machines. So I think the recount is going to tell us that. From my point as the chair of the commission, I think it's most unfortunate that the president-elect is claiming that there's huge problems with our system, and that's feeding what I call this conspiracy theory. I mean, it's just, I personally, I'd like him to come down out of his Trump Tower and go up to Watoma and Washira County and spend the time with the folks on the ground that are counting these votes. I mean, he won that county. But, I mean, to say that it's not being fair or that people are counting illegal votes, from my vantage point, is an insult to the people that run our elections. We have 1,854 municipal clerks and 72 county clerks that deserve better treatment.
What's the
Any other
expectation for people who show up at these counties to watch, observe? What are the guidelines, rules for there, and what say will they have in, like, hey, you can't count that ballot, or you better count that ballot?
Well, first of all, we do invite the public to go to wherever their county canvas, recount canvas is being held, and observe. There's a difference between public observers and observers who are designated by the campaigns. Each candidate can designate at each recount location a primary representative who is the sole person who can raise objections about ballots. They can designate secondary representatives who can ask the tabulators to set aside ballots for further review or possibly to object to those ballots. But so in this case we have 7 candidates. There may be 7 different representatives asking to look at a ballot and decide whether or not they want to raise an objection.
And you had DOJ on the phone. What role do they play in each of these retabulation, the recount? Are they physically on the ground? Are the DA's office physically on the ground?
No, during the election, certainly district attorneys, law enforcement, and DOJ was on site at various polling places just to observe, but they have no formal really or informal role in the recount process. They're welcome to come like any other member of the public as observers, but we would not expect them to be participating unless there's some type of crowd control or disturbance at a location.
Can you address the specifics? The chairman had a harsh criticism of President-elect Trump, which may or may not be warranted. Would you have the same? What would your feelings be about the candidates who are calling for the recount? I mean, after all, the President-elect is not the one putting Wisconsin through this.
My comments are the same. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the count is going to be the same. And the reason I make the distinction is because I'm assuming that the president-elect is going to be the president. And what the president says about our system is very, very important. Much more important to me than, no disrespect to Ms. Stein, but she got 31,006 votes. You know, so, I mean, someone has the bully pulpit and somebody has impact on our citizens' right to trust what happens, you know, down the block at the polling places. And, you know, I've never seen this kind of attack on poll workers and how this system works. And I think it's just, we're going to play it out, and I'm confident that the president-elect is going to win. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that it's timely and it doesn't impact the Electoral College.
Could you address the specifics of how the recount will take place for the votes that were cast on these electronic voting machines? Because that seems to be where some of these issues have been targeted. And can you just talk about that? It sounds like it's going to involve examining a paper trail.
Exactly. And when we talk about the electronic equipment, we're really talking about the touchscreen equipment, to put it in more common parlance. So that equipment has two spools, sort of cash register receipt type spools, that record the ballot that is cast. The voter can verify before the vote is tabulated that the screen has recorded the votes accurately, and the voter can leave with that receipt. The other spool that records the exact same votes is then used for the recount. Did I describe that accurately?
You did.
And so in that case, those votes will be hand counted. They can't go back into the touchscreen machine and look at the results. They will be looking at that spool of the paper trail and counting the votes that way.
Can you detail again what the 8 p.m. deadline is on December 12th versus when the commission member will sign the recount on 3 p.m. the next day?
Right, we're required to give 24 hours notice for our certification of the official results. That's what we will be doing tomorrow for all of the other elections. And so the commission decided today that the deadline for the counties to complete their work will be 8 p.m. on December 12th. And then we will put out a notice by December 12th as to the exact time for our chair or the chair's designee to actually sign the certification.
So at this point, the only real formal role that any candidate, not Jill Stein or De La Fuente, will have in this recount will be in the representatives at the different sites.
Exactly. When Secretary Clinton's campaign says that they want to participate in the recount, that is the same as any other candidate's right to participate in the recount. They have a right to have representatives at the recount, and if there is any litigation that results, I assume the court would allow those candidates also to intervene. And so, to make clear, because we've received questions over the weekend, Secretary Clinton's representatives participating in the recount does not mean that those representatives are counting the ballots. To make that clear, they can be there as observers. They have no more right to count the ballots as representative of the Stein or Trump campaign who might want to volunteer their services to be hired as one of the tabulars.
Nor that it means that they will be paid for the recount.
Exactly. They are not required to pay for the recount.
Let's just take a couple more questions. The staff has to get back and let the campaigns know what they have to pay by tomorrow, and we're trying to get that done by noon for our earlier meeting. So I'll take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up and let the staff go back to work.
But to clarify, looking at each ballot, can Clinton, Stein, Trump, anybody else say that ballot shouldn't be counted, that should be counted, and how will you determine who's a representative of those campaigns at each county site?
So those representatives are required to let the canvass board know, I'm the primary representative, this is our secondary representative, and yes, any of the campaigns can object to a vote, and then it's up to the canvass board to make a decision how that ballot is to be interpreted.
And I mean, this happens in every recount, so I mean, people know how to handle those issues. One more question?
Mike, if you could go over what scenario would trigger, I know you mentioned judicial, what would trigger a hand recount?
As far as the court order,
Yeah.
the standard in the statutes has three parts. One is that there's reason to believe that the voting equipment tabulated ballots inaccurately or may have. Secondly, that a hand count would be more accurate than a voting equipment tally. And third, that there's a likelihood that the result would change by using a hand count. And so that's the reason why I express that seems to be a high burden of proof for any candidate in this case.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah.
I assume that we'll be hanging up.